The idea of sustainable development has become so much of a staple of current debate and commentary that it is sometimes easy to forget that it initially referred specifically to environmental concerns and issues. While we may be reminded of this when, for instance, climate change becomes part of the conversation, we don't often reflect very much on the ecological basis of sustainability and how that relates to development plans and objectives. We are, however, generally aware that development and environment are often seen to be at loggerheads. Pursue development and you may inadvertently produce a great deal of environmental damage. Pass legislation to protect the environment and you may forego job creation, investment and wealth-creating opportunities. The idea and concept of sustainability was propagated in the 1987 Brundtland Report in order to suggest that it may be possible to reconcile these two seemingly conflicting objectives, or to at least keep the deteriorating effects of development in check. Sustainable development would accordingly mean to seek development pathways that would safeguard the integrity of natural regenerative cycles, conserve biodiversity, and replace negative impact activities with cleaner and less intrusive or destructive ones. Sounds good and sensible, doesn't it? In practice, though, the idea of sustainable development has run into a great deal of controversy. Different actors prioritize sometimes radically different understandings of what sustainability should be focused on. A business, for instance, can only be sustained when costs and expenses can be kept in check, and the market for goods or services in question is not constricted. A piece of wetland can only be sustained if contributory freshwater flows are not unduly disrupted. And a forest providing, for instance, firewood may not be sustained if large numbers of people displaced by a violent conflict suddenly begin to rely on this resource. Such and similar problems all seem to lead us back to trade-offs between environment and development, to notions of striking a balance, of finding the right levels of exploiting a certain resource for development gain so that the resource in question may regenerate or not deteriorate in potentially dangerous ways. In such contexts, policymakers and politicians often seek the counsel of scientists. Who better to ask than experts on, for instance, forests and forestry, in order to figure out how this resource can be exploited sustainably? Evidence-based policymaking is one of the phrases used frequently in such contexts, implying an objectivity and no-nonsense factual orientation buttressed and authorized by the best available knowledge. But is the Council of Scientists really always objective and authoritative in this way? This has been a question central to the research field of political ecology. Associated often with the academic discipline of human geography, political ecologists have a history of investigating the environment-development link that reaches back into the 1980s. Central to this approach is the premise that natural resources and environmental harms are often distributed in human societies based on differentiated social and political power. Then, as today, much development policy making sought to involve the best scientific advice available for recommending changes, particularly for people and communities in the global south. Political ecologists noted that scientific research was often mobilized to argue that the practices and knowledges used by, for instance, subsistence farmers in countries in the global south were environmentally detrimental. An example. It was widely assumed and considered to have been scientifically proven that subsistence farmers in Nepal's Himalayan mountains engaged in bad farming practices by moving upwards on steep hillsides. This, it was argued, led to rapid soil erosion and was evidence that local farmers did not have enough or the right knowledge to avoid depleting the crucial resource soil. As Piers Blakey, one of the pioneers of the political ecology approach, showed in his 1985 book, The Political Economy of Soil Erosion in Developing Countries, the idea that poor people didn't know how to farm properly was in most cases plainly wrong. What caused farmers to move up the slopes in Nepal was not ill-considered expansionism, but rather a complex mix of land ownership patterns, population pressures, and induced economic hardship, sometimes interestingly linked directly to development aid efforts. In other words, the assumptions about the causes for soil erosion were wrong because they did not pay sufficient attention, or indeed any at all, to the political factors contributing directly to the phenomenon. But this observation has another implication, namely that the appeal to scientific authority made to explain the deficiencies of subsistence farming practices themselves can now be seen to be political. This is because aid agencies, donors, and implementation agencies are prepared to act on such advice. In today's social climate, this kind of statement may easily be seen to support a blanket dismissal of scientific authority, much like in the case of politicians who decry climate science as an ideology and nothing but a plot against, for instance, the coal industry. Such sentiments could not be further from the analytical outlook maintained by political ecologists. Rather, they advocate a sophisticated approach to understanding the scientific endeavor as a human enterprise and the knowledge produced by it as having been generated in and as communicating into political worlds. With such an understanding, it is possible to appreciate, for instance, that scientific studies such as those that help to produce the product called golden rice are indeed scientifically sound and based on excellent expert knowledge. Golden rice is a genetically modified rice variety that has been altered in order to express beta-carotene, a vitamin A precursor, found, for instance, in carrots. The golden color of the rice stems from this. The idea behind this was simple. Many poor citizens in the subcontinent suffer from vitamin A deficiency. Rice is their staple food, so get rice to express sufficient levels of beta-carotene and you solve the problem. In such and similar contexts, political ecology does not argue that the science behind the product is unsound. Instead, critical attention is turned to what kinds of knowledge are mobilized and what kinds are sidelined when an evidence-based remedy such as golden rice is recommended on behalf of the interest of the poor. What implications does the introduction of golden rice have for local growers? What will its price be relative to conventionally available rice, and what will that mean for altering the diets of the poor? Would it not perhaps be cheaper to make carrots widely available, given that golden rice would have to be subsidized? And what are the wider implications, including ecological ones, for farming systems of introducing and consolidating the use of genetically modified organisms? The example belongs to a much wider controversy over the ecological and sociopolitical implications of the use of bioengineering technologies in agriculture. Advocates stress the benefits in terms of yields, pest and weed management, and anticipated gains in productivity. Critics point to the massive losses of agricultural biodiversity, the entrenchment of harmful monocultural approaches, unanticipated mutagenic pressures, and the increasing dependency of farmers vis-à-vis providers of agricultural technologies. This raises complex questions and the need to bring together different kinds of knowledge and critical thinking in order to both make informed decisions and understand their potential for generating political and ecological problems. Political ecology also challenges the often simplistic assumptions that link environmental scarcities, real or perceived, with security concerns. Such linkages are sometimes sought out by environmental scientists as a means of gaining the attention of policymakers, because labeling something a security threat will give it much greater resonance in policy circles. Focusing on environmental decline as a cause of war or conflict can also detract from the point that entrenched elite interests may still dominate resources access in times of peace, which can ultimately undermine both ecological integrities and social crises. Political ecology is a rich field of inquiry typically grounded in detailed multidisciplinary studies of specific contexts. Research by political ecologists has frequently confounded well-rehearsed and influential assumptions. Ecological change can be shown to be much better understood and sometimes also better managed by communities affected than is commonly assumed. And simplistic understandings, for instance, of climate change as a driver for war and conflict, which do have a great deal of influence among strategic planners, can in many cases be shown to be erroneous. I hope this brief introduction has given you some idea of what an exciting and interesting field of research political ecology is engaged in. And I also hope you can see the practical relevance of its approach at a point in time where ecological political issues are destined to take center stage.